In the summer of 1948, Berlin became the place where the Cold War stopped being an abstract political rivalry and turned into a direct test of will. The city sat deep inside Soviet-controlled Eastern Germany, but it was divided between the victorious Allied powers after World War II. The United States, Britain, and France controlled the western sectors, while the Soviet Union controlled the eastern sector. That unusual arrangement made West Berlin vulnerable. It was a western outpost surrounded by Soviet influence, dependent on access routes that crossed territory controlled by Moscow. When those routes were suddenly cut, the question was brutal and immediate: would the Western Allies abandon Berlin, fight their way in, or find another way to keep the city alive? The roots of the Berlin blockade lay in the unresolved future of post-war Germany. After the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Allies agreed to occupy and administer the country, but they did not agree on what Germany should become. The Western powers increasingly wanted economic recovery, political stability, and integration with democratic Europe. The Soviet Union wanted security, influence, and a buffer against future invasion from the West. These goals were not just different, they were incompatible. Germany became the central battleground between two visions, one based on market recovery and Western alignment, the other based on Soviet security and communist influence. Berlin, because of its symbolic and strategic position, became the pressure point. The immediate trigger was currency reform. In 1948, the Western Allies introduced the Deutsche Mark in their occupation zones to stabilize the economy and replace the weakened old currency. They also introduced it in West Berlin, even though the city was surrounded by the Soviet zone. To Moscow, this looked like the West was consolidating its part of Germany into a separate state and pulling West Berlin into that orbit. The Soviets demanded that the Western Allies remove the new currency from West Berlin. When the demand was not accepted, the Soviet Union moved to force the issue by cutting off the city's land and water access to the western sectors. On June 24, 1948, the blockade began. Railways, roads, and canals linking West Berlin to the western occupation zones were closed or disrupted. For the people of West Berlin, this was not a symbolic act. It threatened food supplies, fuel, electricity, medicine, and daily survival. The city had more than 2 million people, and modern urban life could not continue without steady deliveries of coal, flour, milk, and other essentials. The Soviets expected the Western Allies to face a painful choice. If they withdrew, Moscow would gain a major political victory. If they tried to break the blockade by force, the crisis could escalate into war. The Western Allies chose a third option: supply West Berlin by air. At first, the idea seemed almost impossible. An entire city needed to be sustained from the sky, day after day, in all weather, using transport aircraft that had never been meant to replace railways and canals on this scale. The original target was about 3,475 tons of supplies per day. That meant not only food, but especially coal, because coal powered heating, electricity, and industry. The plan required strict coordination, rapid unloading, constant maintenance, and disciplined flight corridors. What began as a desperate improvisation soon became a massive logistical machine. The airlift began on June 26, 1948, only 2 days after the blockade started. American and British aircraft flew into Berlin along agreed air corridors that the Soviets did not close, partly because interfering with them risked a direct military confrontation. The operation demanded precision. Planes had to arrive in sequence, land quickly, unload fast, and leave to make room for the next aircraft. If one plane missed its landing window, it could disrupt the flow behind it. Over time, the system became astonishingly efficient. At the height of the airlift, a plane reached West Berlin roughly every 30 seconds, turning the sky into a conveyor belt of survival. The aircraft themselves became icons of the crisis. American C-47s and larger C-54s carried huge quantities of supplies across millions of miles. British transports, including converted civilian and military aircraft, also played a major role. Commonwealth crews from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa assisted the RAF, while the French supported their own garrison. The numbers grew far beyond the initial expectations. By spring 1949, the airlift was not merely meeting the original target, it was often doubling it. On its peak day, nearly 12,941 tons of supplies were delivered. What was supposed to be impossible was now outperforming many traditional supply lines. Coal was the hidden foundation of the operation. Food mattered, but without coal, West Berlin would freeze, factories would stop, and power generation would fail. Nearly two-thirds of the total cargo carried during the airlift was coal. Delivering it by air was dirty, heavy, inefficient work, but it was essential. Every sack represented heat, light, and resistance to pressure. The airlift also delivered medicine, powdered milk, flour, and other necessities. This was not just about moving goods. It was about proving that a modern city could survive even when surrounded and isolated, as long as its protectors were willing to bear the enormous cost. The Berlin Airlift also became a battle for public opinion. One of its most memorable stories was Operation Little Vittles, started by pilot Gail Halvorsen, who dropped small parachutes carrying candy for Berlin children. These aircraft became known as raisin bombers or candy bombers. In material terms, candy was not decisive. But psychologically, it mattered enormously. German children who had recently lived through war now saw Allied pilots not as occupiers, but as protectors. The gesture helped transform relationships between former enemies. West Berliners increasingly identified the United States and Britain as their shield against coercion, and the airlift became a symbol of commitment rather than occupation. The operation was dangerous. Aircraft flew constantly, often in poor weather, under intense pressure, with little margin for error. 17 American and 8 British aircraft crashed during the airlift. In total, 101 people died, including 40 Britons and 31 Americans, most of them in flying accidents. These losses are sometimes overshadowed by the success of the mission, but they were part of the cost. The airlift was not a clean propaganda spectacle. It was a physically demanding, risky, industrial-scale operation performed by pilots, ground crews, mechanics, controllers, and laborers who kept the system moving every hour of every day. For the Soviet Union, the blockade became increasingly counterproductive. The original assumption was that the West could not keep Berlin supplied from the air for long. But as the airlift improved, the blockade turned into an embarrassment. Instead of exposing Western weakness, it demonstrated Western resolve and technical capacity. At the same time, the blockade caused economic problems in East Berlin and hardened divisions across Germany. On May 12, 1949, the Soviet Union lifted the blockade. Yet the Western Allies did not immediately stop flying. They continued supplying the city for months, worried that Moscow might resume pressure or try to disrupt supply lines again. The Berlin airlift officially ended on September 30, 1949, after 15 months of continuous effort. By then, American and British forces had flown more than 278,000 flights and delivered over 2.3 million tons of supplies. The U.S. Air Force carried the majority, while the RAF delivered a major share as well. The political consequences lasted far longer than the operation itself. The crisis helped lock West Berlin into the Western camp and deepened the division between East and West Germany. It also strengthened support for Western security structures, eventually helping pull West Germany toward NATO. The blockade failed to push the West out of Berlin. Instead, it turned Berlin into one of the Cold War's defining symbols of resistance. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.